Doctors, what patient made you think, how on earth are you even alive right now? I've worked emergency medicine for a long time, and you get used to a certain amount of, how are you still standing? But one guy is a permanent legend in our department, and it's not for what you'd think. His name doesn't matter. We just call him the toolbox, because every time he shows up, it's because of something he did to himself with a power tool while insisting he knew what he was doing. Over the years, he'd come in with a nail gun injury, a grinder incident, and one memorable evening where he'd stapled his own hand to a fence and driven himself in. So when I saw his name on the board last winter, I already braced myself. What I was not braced for was the triage note, which just read, ambulatory, chainsaw, says he's fine. I walked into the room and there he was, sitting upright on the gurney, completely calm, holding a blood-soaked kitchen towel against his thigh, scrolling on his phone. Evening, doc, he said, like we were about to discuss the weather. I asked him what happened. He told me very casually that he'd been cutting a fallen tree in his yard. The saw had kicked back, and it had gotten him a little. I peeled back the towel and had to work very hard to keep my face neutral, because a little was a laceration deep enough that I could see structures no patient should be describing to me while calm. I asked him how long ago this happened. He thought about it and said, what's today? That is never the answer you want. It turned out he'd done this to himself 2 days earlier, wrapped it in a towel, and kept working, because he didn't want to make a whole thing of it, and only came in now because his wife noticed the towel had changed colors a few times. 2 days. He'd been walking around, driving, sleeping, mowing the rest of his lawn apparently, with an injury that by every measure should have put him on the floor from blood loss alone, and the man was sitting in front of me asking if he could get a coffee from the vending machine while we sorted it out. I have genuinely seen people pass out from a paper cut who were in less trouble than he was. His vitals were doing this thing where his body had just quietly decided to compensate for 2 days straight rather than inconvenience him. My nurse looked at the monitor, then at me, then at him, and mouthed the words, how, from across the room. I've had trauma surgeons on the phone who didn't believe my description of his numbers, who assumed I was reading the chart wrong, and I had to keep repeating, no, he walked in on his own 2 feet, holding his phone. And the first thing he asked me was whether the vending machine took cards. We got him prepped, and while we worked, he kept up a running commentary about how he heals fast and always has, and told me a story about the time he fell off a barn roof and just walked it off. I told him honestly that he was the most alarmingly durable human being I had ever treated, and that his luck was going to run out one of these days. He seemed genuinely flattered, like I'd complimented his truck. When I explained how close he'd actually come, that another day, maybe less, and we would not be having this conversation, he nodded thoughtfully and said, see, that's why I came in. As if arriving 48 hours into a life-threatening injury was a triumph of caution. We patched him up and he did fine, of course he did, because the universe clearly has a separate rulebook for this man. But here's the part that made the whole department lose it. As he was leaving, discharge papers in hand, strict instructions to rest, he stopped at the desk and asked my nurse, completely sincerely, whether he'd be okay to finish the tree that weekend, because it was half done and bugging him. She just stared at him. I leaned over the counter and said, sir, if you touch that chainsaw before those stitches heal, I will personally be very interested to see what excuse you use to survive it. He laughed, said, fair enough, doc, and walked out into the parking lot, upright, steady, driving himself home again like a man who had simply misplaced his sense of mortality somewhere and never gone back for it. I have no medical explanation for him. Some people are just built out of spite and duct tape, and honestly, at this point, I hope I never find out what finally stops him.